Why don't you just start by telling me about sort of Steve Levitt's role in your life? And I'll assume that because I'm old, anyone who comes on here will know who Steve Levitt is. So, so he's pretty important in your life. Why don't you tell that story?
Yeah, so my first introduction to Stephen Levitt and his style of economics came when I was going off to college. I was going to MIT to study what I thought was going to be engineering, but on the way there, on the plane ride, my dad gave me the book Freakonomics, and I read it, and immediately I was like, this is so interesting. This is what I want to do. I had an interest in math and science since middle school, really, and I was encouraged to pursue that. But I was always interested in people, but I never really resonated with sociology or psychology or even neuroscience. It was just too much memorization. It didn't really make sense to me. But economics provided this really logical framework for understanding why people behave the way they do. Freakonomics is all about incentives, and this incentives idea really resonated with me. And so once I got to MIT, I felt like it was perfect because he had gone to graduate school there. MIT taught this really mathematical style of economics that made sense to me personally, and I just decided to switch over into econ, even though that wasn't exactly what my dad wanted to happen when he gave me that book. He wanted me to stick with engineering, but it was too late at that point.
And then later on, Steve Levitt enters your life, right?
Yes. So I applied to graduate school at the University of Chicago. I miraculously get in because even back then it was really hard to get into grad school. So I was super pleased to get into U Chicago. And when I went to the preview weekend, I got to meet Steve Levitt and talk to him about going there. And he was supportive of me going there. And I immediately wanted him to be my advisor. And I took his classes. I ended up being his teaching assistant, and he was my principal advisor on my thesis. So yeah, I really got to fulfill that that line of work for a while until towards the end of grad school when I realized that there really wasn't a future for me in academia doing Steve Levitt style research. Like, that ship had already sailed. But luckily, tech econ was emerging, and it was a really great place to apply those principles of incentives and causal inference. So that's where I went.
Okay, so you went into the tech world and into a company that shall not be named or something.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, we'll get into some stories about that because that's sort of interesting too. But I think you make the point that I mean, okay, so Steve Levitt, for people who don't know this, won the John Bates Clark Medal, right? Which is like in some ways more prestigious than the Nobel Prize. And yet, I think he's kind of well, he and academia seem to me have separated in some sense. Do you know anything about that? Why that's true, and sort of whose fault it is in this divorce, as it were?
I mean, yeah, this is definitely secondhand stuff. But even when I was in grad school, there was conflict between Levitt and Heckman and other figures within academia. I think that his success as a writer maybe was not working towards his reputation as an academic. I mean, since Freakonomics has come out, a lot of people have criticized the work that was in it. I think that you have to kind of take it for the book that it was at the time, and it was really revolutionary at the time, and the methods that we had back then are not as good as the methods we have now. So I think that criticism is pretty unfair. I think what Levitt really taught me, though, was the the communication aspect of economics, that people really only understand results when put into the framework of a story. And I think that's why I ended up, pursuing writing and communication so much, was because of that aspect of what he taught me. I think the things that interest me most about economics are those really simple but also important questions that maybe don't use the most fancy techniques, but are still important for everyday people and businesses and all of that. So I think he's been really influential in those spaces.
Okay, well, now I'll put in the first plug for your book, uh, because your book expresses that, trying to make it relevant to everyday people, and you do a great job of telling stories there. But back to Steve Levitt, like, what would he say now about academia? Do you think is he bitter about it? Is he sanguine about it?
I don't talk to him enough to know like his inner feelings, but based on his actions, I know that he's left academia, so I feel like that says a lot.
Yeah, for someone who was like on that, like winning the Clark Medal, that's a real move. So, um, how do you feel about the differences between MIT economics and Chicago economics? So you had both. Uh, would you have any advice for an undergrad or a would-be undergrad or a would-be grad student based on those two, your experiences in those two?
Sure. I think that like if I went back to my high school self and thought about whether I wanted to go to MIT or versus UC Chicago, knowing that I wanted to study economics, like not thinking that I was going to be an engineer, I still would have chosen MIT for me personally. I think that it's a lot less competitive of a major at MIT because it's not as popular of a major. Like most people do go there for math and science. So there's no oversubscription of courses the way that there is at U Chicago. Like at Steve Levitt's class, which I TA'd, there was a waiting list to get into that class. There were no waiting lists to get into any classes in MIT. You could just take whatever classes you wanted. And you could even cross register at Harvard or Wellesley because they had that cross registration program. And I also felt like as a woman and a person of color that MIT did a lot better of a job supporting that or like acknowledging that there were differences there. Whereas at U Chicago, I don't think that there was really any acknowledgement of disadvantage based on race or gender. But that, I mean, I went there for graduate school, so maybe I'm over exact. Maybe it was different if you were an undergrad there. Maybe there were undergraduate resources that I wasn't aware of. But I would still choose MIT for my undergraduate like education. I think that it was just a really great place to go as an undergrad, whether you're majoring in econ or anything else.
And grad school, do you think there are any advantages to MIT over Chicago or vice versa?
I think the big advantage for me going to use Chicago over any of the other number one schools, because they're all tied for number one up there, is the name recognition. Like people really do think of Chicago when they think of economics. When you think of like if you think about economics, like Harvard is great at it, but they're great at so many other things, and it doesn't really stand out in terms of people's psyche the way that having a PhD from U Chicago does. And also people understand that U Chicago is very difficult to graduate from. And it is very difficult place to like just be in terms of the seminar environment. So I think that like having the PhD from U Chicago has been a really powerful signal in my career, probably greater than one from Harvard or MIT or Stanford or the other number one places.
Okay. So um, if you had sort of a recent college graduate that was approximately like you, would you say to that person, go to the University of Chicago, or would you say maybe think about a different career path given how you feel academics is going?
Mm, I think that getting a PhD in economics is still really valuable. Getting a master's is starting to become more comparable. So I don't know if staying for 5, 6, 7 years is really better than staying for 2 years and just leaving with a master's or going out quickly like I did. I got my PhD in 4 years, but that was because I knew I wanted to go to the private sector and I had advisors that thought that I was ready to get my degree and move on from that. So I think that like it kind of depends on what your goals are after graduate school. Uh, because I don't know if you get. I don't think that U Chicago guarantees you a better academic placement than the other number one graduate programs. I think that at least from the data I've seen, the other top economics departments are a bit better at placing and mentoring people. But then again, it like so much depends on who your advisor is. So if you know of an advisor that you want to work with and they want to work with you, I think that's even more important than the department as a whole, especially if you are trying to stay in academia.
Okay. Um, so your book seems to me to be kind of an advice book geared really toward a young person. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah,
Um,
like the person I had in mind was somebody younger than me who was starting off in their career. But yeah, I mean, if other people enjoy it, I'm happy to have those readers too.
Yeah. Um, and sort of what are there particular lessons in that book that you feel like, boy, I really wish I'd learned that lesson before I actually learned it.
Sorry, I got a spam call right where you're talking.
Okay. All right. Um, so like what might be the one or two lessons in, and I guess, and I'm going to display the book again.
Mhm.
Uh, the one or two lessons that you really missed when you were going through whatever you were going through at the time.
Yeah, when I was starting my career, it was around 2014, 2015. It was just after that book Lean In had come out by Sheryl Sandberg, and I read that book thinking that it was gonna help me in my career, but I found it, like, not very useful, and what I found more useful was what I had learned in economics, specifically in game theory, to understand how to navigate workplace environments, questions about negotiating or getting promoted, or how to interact with the boss. Like I had learned more useful things in game theory and labor economics than I had from those books from people who had advanced their careers and wanted to tell me about it. The things that I went back to a lot in economics was this idea of inside options versus outside options in a game, like in a negotiation. A lot of negotiation advice will tell you like you need to say the first number or you need to be confident or you need to do these other things that signal certain things to get a better deal. But what I learned in game theory is like ultimately the person with the better outside options is the one that usually wins the negotiation, or the person who is more patient, or the person who is most willing to walk away. It all has to do with the outside option. And so understanding what outside options your negotiating partner has, whether you're a buyer negotiating with the seller of a home, or you're an employee negotiating with your boss, or you're in a relationship with your partner negotiating about like who's going to do the dishes. Understanding those outside options for yourself and for the person you're negotiating against will help you navigate that better. And related to that is asymmetric information, understanding that there's hidden information that other players might have that you don't have, and seeking out that kind of information and getting an information advantage is another thing that comes up in the book a lot.
And so, how does your partner feel about you playing those games? Does he ever complain, or is he
Well, one thing I talk about in the book is that relationships are repeated games. So there is like, even economics would say that you should be nice to your partner if you're going to be negotiating with them over and over again. You want to leave something on the table. You don't want to be completely ruthless in one round of the game because it might hurt you in later rounds. Brinkmanship is not something that can really help foster trust in a relationship. So I think game theory actually does teach how to have those repeated negotiations and how to respect your negotiating partner if you're going to be coming back to them over and over again the way you do in a relationship.
okay? And I was interested in the story of the two guys with you label with J's, yeah,
Yeah, Jake and Jared.
Jay and Jared, at the corporation that will not be named, but anyone could guess it if they knew where it was. Um, so you want to just tell us that story?
Yeah, so I was working in Seattle at a large tech company, which you can probably guess which one it was. And I was working on employee satisfaction. Like, why are employees satisfied? How does that relate to their productivity? How does that relate to whether they're quitting their jobs or not? That was my main focus for this population of call center employees. And one day at work, we had a meeting with our senior vice president who told us that he had visited one of the locations in India and heard from one of the employees that they were really unhappy with the mandatory overtime policy. Employees were being randomly assigned to do overtime, and it was really disruptive to their schedules and their lives, according to this one employee. But the senior vice president, wanted to back it up with data because at this company, they never go based just on the anecdote. They want to see the data when making a decision. So that project was assigned to me because it was like in my area. I went and got the data from the people who assigned shifts at this India site. I analyzed it and found that, like, just on the surface, it actually looked like the people assigned mandatory overtime were more satisfied with their jobs. But then when I dug into the data, I noticed that they were much younger tenured at the company because they had been quitting more often and earlier than the employees who were not assigned the mandatory overtime. So it was classic selection bias in economics. We weren't seeing the dissatisfied people assigned to work overtime because they were quitting before we had the chance to enter them into our data and measure their satisfaction. So I took this result to the vice president to our team. I emailed it out to my manager first and my director so that they could see it before going up to the senior level. And I also emailed it, who then they forwarded it to the other team that was doing the shifts, and the director forwarded it to this manager who started poking his nose into my research and wanted to meet with me about it. And so I went to this meeting with the two people, Jake and Jared, who were in charge of assigning overtime, and they had a ton of questions for me. I tried to explain selection bias. I thought I did a good job of it, but they still were pretty dense about why I was focusing on attrition when the senior vice president was only asking about satisfaction. And I explained to them how selection bias works, but they were still finding like holes in it. And when they heard that I was only using data from one site, they were like, no, 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 you have to do this for every site that we have mandatory overtime. So I was like, okay, fine. I go and get the data from all the sites. I redo the analysis. I get the exact same results. These employees are clearly less satisfied, quitting at higher rates with like a 99% p-value. I take it back to them, or I email it out again, and they email me again asking to meet. And I'm like really confused at this point about why they keep pressing on it. I thought I did this great job of explaining it, and it was crystal clear from my perspective what was going on. I talked to my director because I had a regular one-on-one with her, and I told her what was going on. And she was like really blunt with me and told me that they didn't respect me because I'm a woman. And I was like so taken aback by that, but she was a woman, and she was like she was the youngest woman to be promoted to director at the company. So I felt like if she was saying that, there was probably like she probably knew what she was talking about. And so at this point, I'm like really thinking that they're messing with me. And I related it to this idea of the hawk dove game in game theory, where when when there's a resource, you can either cooperate and act nice to each other like doves and just split the resource, or you can act like a hawk and steal the resource and hurt your partner. And if both people act like hawks, then you get less resource because you just end up splitting it and everybody's hurt, and you're worse off than if you had just cooperated. And it felt like these people were secretly hawks, like they were secretly trying to hurt me and steal this resource of work product, or at least destroy it in some way so that they would be better off. I didn't really understand why they would be better off, but I went to a meeting with them. They kept pressing me over and over again about the result. I was starting to get pissed, like just annoyed that they kept pressing me on it. And finally they kept saying like, oh, you need more data. Like, oh, you only got 1/4 of data. You need a whole year's worth of data for this result to be true. But I already knew that like the p-value was 1%, and there's over testing in economics. Like you don't want to keep going back to the data, getting more data just to prove some result you have in your head. That's how you introduce bias into it. So I was starting to get really annoyed that they were corrupting my research by making me keep going back and getting more data to find the result that they wanted. I was also annoyed that they didn't seem to care at all about the satisfaction of these thousands of employees that they were responsible for. They didn't want to make them better off. They just cared. Well, they gave it away. They said it would be so much work for them to redo all the schedules. And that's when I realized like what they were really after. They didn't want to redo the schedules. They had some goal to meet some cost metric, and redoing the schedules and make them fail at their goals. They didn't want this result to see the light of day. And so finally, I was just like, listen, like, I know this result is true. It's like I'm looking at a picture of a dog, and you're telling me that I need to go get an HD photo to know that I'm looking at a dog, even though I can see it in standard definition. And getting more pixels isn't going to make the dog disappear. Like, it's still going to be there. And that really pissed them off. And the one guy, Jake, like, he slammed his fist on the table and was like, you don't know that. And he like started yelling at me. And the other guy got totally embarrassed because he had given it up, that they were like, just pissed at me that I had this result. They weren't really interested in understanding it or getting to the right answer. And at that point, I was just like, whatever. I'll get you the more data. I'm going to do this one more time, but I'm going to send the result directly to the vice president instead of to you this time, and you're just going to have to talk to him about it. So that's what I did, and the vice president ended up eliminating mandatory overtime after that. And so it was a win for the employees. At least they got rid of this mandatory policy, and it became optional at that point.
Yeah. I actually, my first private sector job was with Freddie Mac, and within a few months, I got into a conflict with another department sort of similar. We were, they were not statisticians at all. They were the multifamily lending program, and so we didn't even talk the same language. They felt very
Yeah.
threatened by, economics and statistics intruding on their stuff. And anyway, it people don't like that, and I guess they probably, their ego is for maybe even more threatened, like you say, when it's coming from a female. So yeah, those, and it's amazing how intense those conflicts seem when you're there, and then when you leave, you think, oh, you know, okay, it was a conflict. These things happen in this corporate soap opera, as I call it, happens all the time. Yeah, that was the first of many, many conflicts that I had.
Yeah, yeah. And I
Affairs.
think it's really important for like people who are trained in economics to acknowledge or understand that not everyone like wants to hear them, and you have to stand up for your results. I mean, maybe that was what Chicago taught me, is how to how to defend my results, because I had definitely had them questioned by, Nobel Prize winning economists, like, what does this manager who's not an economist have to say
Yeah.
to me about it? But I've seen a lot of people like cower or try to walk away from that, and that's one thing that can really hold you back in your career, is that you could do the best work in the world, but if somebody is stopping it from seeing the light of day, no one's going to know it, and it's not going to have any impact.
Yeah. Yeah, no, Chicago has a reputation of being that seminar environment being pretty tough. After you survive that, Jake and Jared probably didn't seem very all that formidable.
No,
Um,
no.
okay, I'd like to, if I can figure out how to do it, because I'd like to switch topics. Let's see if I can do this. I'm physically trying to invite another person up. I see he's joined, but I don't see what I have to do to invite him. Okay, I'll try to figure it out. But anyway, so what the topic I wanted to switch to, I mean, there's a lot more to the book, and I hope people get a sense that it is being, even though you use the terminology, or some would say jargon, of economics and game theory, that it really is done through stories. I hope we've conveyed that. Um, wow. I just don't see. Here we go. How about this? Okay, while I'm scrolling through, what's your current take on the housing market as a Redfin chief economist?
Well, the housing market is in a really bad place in terms of sales. We've been like near this rock bottom of about 4 million existing home sales since halfway through 2023, because of how high mortgage rates are, but also how high the mortgage rates are relative to where they were during the pandemic. They went down to 3% during the pandemic for a 30-year fixed rate, and now it's like close to 6.8%, I think. And that just makes it much more expensive to borrow money to buy a home. And also, existing homeowners who have 3% rates really don't want to sell because they don't want to give up their cheap mortgages. That was a story of 2024, still largely the story of 2025. But on top of that, we have, hello, we
Okay,
have
let me
this trade
introduce you
war.
guys. This is Daryl Fairweather, the chief economist at Redfin. I'm tempted to make a joke you've heard a million times of a Fairweather friend, but and then this is Moses Sternstein, who writes the Random Walk podcast and is a real data freak. I would describe him. His newsletter typically has many charts, so he must spend a lot of time on the data. Okay, so finish your story. The housing market and the people with the 3% interest rates.
Yeah, so in 2024, that was the story of the housing market, this mortgage rate lock in effect, housing affordability being really bad for buyers. And then in 2025, we thought things would start to improve a bit, that mortgage rates would come down, that more sellers would come to the table because they're just exhausted with their homes. We have seen more new listings, but really not more sales, because the affordability problems have really only gotten worse because of tariffs. Mortgage rates have remained high. And also, on top of that, all the economic uncertainty. is causing buyers to back off. So we're seeing a bit more sellers, but not more buyers and not more sales. And that's probably going to mean prices come down this year. I don't think they'll come down by a lot, maybe like 1%. They'll come down in real terms relative to inflation. But I think the fact that existing homeowners have record levels of equity, have extremely good credit scores, we're not going to see the kind of forced sales that would result in price declines less greater than that.
All right. So Moses, you want to give us your take on you've been I'll put words in your mouth that you've been saying that the marks are too high, that the typical homeowner is not ready to mark down the price enough to the market. Is that
Yeah, I mean, actually, it's funny because I don't. I mean, I think your outlook is, it's fairly consistent with with what I've been saying. I guess I maybe have been just been a little bit early, but yeah, my view has been, the lack of transaction volume is sort of hiding, which again, not catastrophic price declines, but if price declines are there insofar as it's like purchasing power has declined. So, but the fact is that I think home values are pretty sticky, and the beauty of the 30-year mortgage and fixed interest rates is that home sellers rather don't have to sell if they don't get a price that they want to see. So and I sort of have this line. I mean, I think the marks are too damn high. I think that's true across private capital markets and for most relatively illiquid assets, just because again they're still priced to an interest rate regime that just doesn't exist anymore, and probably won't, for the foreseeable future. It's not necessarily specific to housing, but in the case of housing, yeah, I think actually, a supply is building. Things aren't trading, and I think if you did have volume sort of return to historical levels, you would have to see prices come down. I agree, it's not a catastrophe, assuming people don't lose their jobs. But yeah, I think that home values are lower than they appear. I think that's fair.
you want to put a number on that? Like, are they 5% lower? Or are they 10% lower? What?
I don't know. I have it. I don't know. I mean, I don't know exactly. I mean, somewhere between those two. I don't think 10% sounds maybe high. I would have to do the math of like, what it would be if you return sort of existing home sale volumes to what they were traditionally. I mean, I think one of the things that I do tend to look at is look at the new home market, which is where, of course, things are actually trading, right? Because builders are not in they're not in the asset appreciation business. They're in the commodity business of building and selling homes. So for them, they will build and sell and price to market. And for them, I think the median home, has the value. Let's see if I can find it. Median home value for new homes has come down sequentially, I think, since the interest rates went up. I guess the caveat, and again, you probably know more about this than I've forgotten, but is that they've also been building smaller homes, which is again to me a feature of building and pricing to market. But that does, on a per square foot, that probably does obscure the math a little bit.
So, Daryl, where do you think the equilibrium is where we would have, well, how many home sales would we have normally? How many existing home sales on a monthly basis or like annualized basis would we have normally? And what kind of prices would it take to get us there?
I'm I have to look it up if I want that
Yeah.
number. I think it's like maybe 20% higher, but I don't remember off the top of my head. I can look it up. But like you can see in certain markets that prices are coming down. They're coming down in Florida, they're coming down in Texas, they're coming down in the condo market, especially. Condos are are less unique than single family homes right now because it's very clear that if you are going to rent an apartment, you are better off renting it than you are owning it at prevailing mortgage rates and also at prevailing HOA fee levels. HOA fees are going up in Florida and Texas, and that's hurting their condo markets even more. So I think that like if you look in segments of the market, you are seeing the kind of correction that is large. But in
Yeah,
other markets, yeah.
I always say that condos are like high beta. That is, when everything else is going up a little bit, they'll go up a lot and down also. But you're pointing to some specific issues in the condo market with the HOA fees and so on.
Yes, and
Is that because of insurance, by the way?
yes. What's different about Florida and Texas compared to the rest of the country, was one, they have increasing insurance rates. Their insurance is going up faster there. It's also going up in California, but it's going up really fast in Texas and Florida because of weather. HOA fees have gone up a lot recently in Florida because of the Surfside condo collapse. There were new rules that were put on HOAs that mandate that they like shore up their resources so they can maintain the home so we don't have another accident like that. And also because they have this collective space that needs to be insured, like you insure the roof for every condo owner. They're a bit better about insurance than a single family homeowner in Florida who might not increase their insurance coverage to meet the risk because they would rather just like defer that cost, or they're just going to sell if their home is damaged. They don't want the insurance. So I think that the condo owners are less able to delay the impacts of climate change than a single family homeowner. So we're seeing those values go down faster in Florida and Texas. And then another feature of Florida and Texas is that they have higher property taxes than, say, California. So when values go up, there's a reason for sellers to start selling, because if they get a higher property tax bill that they can afford, then they would have to sell in order to get out from under that. But in California, there isn't that same pressure on existing homeowners to sell. They just have their fixed mortgage rate, their essentially fixed property taxes. They even have their fair insurance plan that subsidizes insurance if they get kicked off of their primary insurance. So I think the homeowners are much more entrenched there, which is why home values aren't correcting the way that we're seeing in other markets.
So, I guess so it's not a national market, so maybe my question is a little unfair to say, well, should prices be 5% or 10% lower to kind of get to the last to a quote normal level of home sales? But does that still sound like a ballpark, or is that too high, too much of a decline, or?
So prices to decline by that much? I think that, yeah, I don't know. When I think like I just don't really know the thought experiment where we get 5% lower home values without there being like something else going on in the economy, which would also impact demand. So yeah, maybe. Well, yeah, what scenario are we talking about?
I guess sort of, well, a scenario in which uh, home sellers kind of cave in and say, okay, I'm going to sell at market price even if I'm not happy about it.
Yeah, so
Maybe.
there is a $40,000 gap between what home sellers are listing their homes for right now and what homes are actually selling for. But what's kind of masked in that is that it's not necessarily that all homes need to take a $40,000 price cut in order to get sold. Homes that are below the median price or around the median price are still selling for their asking prices. It's the higher priced homes that just simply aren't selling, and the sellers aren't budging on price. They're just letting them sit on the market right now. They might pull them off the market if they decide that, their mortgage is cheap and they'd rather rent it out. They might take a price cut later on, but that wouldn't necessarily change the median sale price all that much if they're these luxury homes that are coming down in price and not the median priced home that's coming down in price.
Okay. So what's the best thing about being the chief economist of Redfin?
Well, I get to communicate about economics a lot to the outside world. When I was at my previous role at the tech company, it was all very internal, and I did do a lot of economics communication there. I mean, anytime that you're talking to somebody who's not an economist, you have to figure out how to get your message across to them. But talking to like everyday people all the time, doing these kinds of podcasts, doing interviews, it really helps me practice conveying why economics is important, why it's important to understand this kind of stuff. So I like that aspect of the job a lot.
Okay. And so I think it was Moses told me that there's a deal in the works with Rocket Mortgage. You know anything about that we don't know?
Well, if I knew, I'm not supposed to know anything that you don't know. Everything's supposed to be very public at this point, which is why they're not really telling us a whole lot, because then they'd have to tell everybody. But what I do know is that, yeah, we are in the process of being acquired, merged with Rocket Mortgage. I know that one reason that Rocket acquired us is they want to engage with people in their housing market journey earlier, like at the point where they start searching for a home or even searching for a rental, which we now have on Redfin. So vertical integration in that way. And they also are interested in our data. And as an economist, it's really exciting that we will potentially have their data as well, because the more data we get, the more interesting research we get to do.
Okay. Well, what's an example of research that you've done that really you found interesting? Can you share something about that?
Yeah, the research I'm most proud of is this academic paper, actually, I did with Matt Kahn, Robert Metcalf, and Sebastian Sandoval Olascuago. I hope I pronounced that right. And it was about this experiment that we did at Redfin. We started putting climate data on Redfin in 2020. We were really nervous about it at first. We weren't sure how people using our website and app would react to seeing climate scores, if they would think it was like a political thing, if they would think that it was inaccurate and they didn't want it on there. So we did a long 3-month experiment where half of our users saw flood scores on listings and half did not. We got the data from First Street, which is a third party that does climate evaluations. And what we found was that the people who were searching for homes on Redfin, who were exposed to flood risk information and were previously searching for extremely or severely risky homes, went on to make offers on homes with half as much risk compared to the control group. So we had this really clean causal experiment and knew for certain that these flood scores were changing what homes people ultimately were buying. We didn't know this before because in the data and the macro data, all we saw was that people were generally moving to riskier places. They were moving to Florida because it's cheaper, because it's sunnier. But then when you had the actual A/B test, we could see clearly that no, this information is changing the way that people buy homes, even it's just not big enough yet to trump these other factors like affordability or weather.
So, is there going to be a corporate decision then to include all this? You know,
Oh yeah,
to
yeah, we've since we did the experiment for 3 months and then not based on the academic research, but based on the feedback we got, we didn't get really any negative responses from sellers. And we found that people were engaging with the data. Based on that, we now have flood risk, heat risk, storm risk, and air quality risk. And I think there might be another one that I'm forgetting. Oh, fire risk. Yes.
okay. So yeah, so for the California people, um, and so in
Can you
some
still hear
cases,
me? I'm gonna have to plug in my phone, which means I'm not gonna have as much of a microphone. But can you still hear me?
okay, yeah, still
Yep.
Okay,
can, but
great.
yeah, we probably only go about 5 more minutes or so. Just the recording. If the recording goes up to an hour, I think it turns people off. So
Okay.
try to keep them a little
Yeah.
short.
I did. I
Um,
did. I did find some data on some of the stuff that we were talking about before. If you have a second.
sure.
Yeah.
So I just again, this is sort of rough, but it looks like the median sales price for a new home indexed to April 2022, which I guess when rates started going up, are down about 8.5%. So again, that's not necessarily a perfect proxy for, let's say, what a more liquid housing market, what prices would look like in a more liquid housing market, but I think it's not a terrible one. But I think now new homes are what I mean. They're more than 40%. I think of total sales at this point, if I remember correctly. Um, and I guess the other one is this chart that I really like that Goldman puts out, and it's from a year ago, but mortgage rates are about the same. And um, so they're basically like the three things that would have to happen to return affordability to pre-COVID averages: either home prices have to come down 41%, incomes have to rise by 70%, or mortgage rates have to come down by 4.3 percentage points.
Mm.
Which again, like my view that it's the interest rates more than anything that have driven the recent affordability issues, or at least the change in interest rates in the 30-year rate. But I think to me that's where I sort of get this. I think most people can't afford their own homes at the prices that they think that they are worth.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
those are big numbers, but in part that's because of um, the payment tilt in the 30-year mortgage. 'Cause I
yeah,
remember this I'm old enough to when we bought our home, we had a 12.5% mortgage, and that was bought down by the builder. He contributed money to lower it from what it would have been. And so in those days, um, nothing was affordable, right? It was just, but you were counting on inflation. So you sat there and you would say, all right, I'll absorb this huge monthly payment, knowing that in an inflationary environment, this is the late 70s, early 80s, that your salary is going to be going up 5% or more a year. You know that your house price is going to be going up. So, so people could sort of absorb the lack of affordability. I think people aren't in that environment now. I think all they see is this high interest rate. They don't necessarily see their salary going up. They don't necessarily foresee the house appreciating. So I don't know. Do you have any comments on that, Daryl? Or sort of because I guess my point is the economics of housing are not as bad as, you need a 40% increase in salary or whatever, assuming that the real interest rate hasn't gone up that much. So the economics of buying a house are not quite as horrible as that sounds, but the affordability is bad. Am I making any sense? Or no?
Yes. Well, there's inelastic demand for housing. Like people need a place to live. They're gonna spend money to have a place to live. Even they'll sacrifice other things first before sacrificing having shelter. So, I just going back to the original question. I I don't think that we're going to get back to pre-pandemic affordability levels without building massively more housing. Like it's not going to happen through a correction in and of itself, because even though we did build during the pandemic, it wasn't enough to dig us out of the hole that we got into in the 2010s when we really weren't building at all. And currently, like permits are down. So the wave of new construction is already largely over. In markets where homes are easy to build, like in Austin, Texas, for example, we had this peak in prices in 2022, and now home prices are back down to like normal or closer to normal levels. It's still above pre-pandemic levels, but closer to like 2021 levels instead of the 2023 levels. So when you build, you do see prices come back down, but in so many parts of the country, it's nearly impossible to build enough housing to get back to a level of affordability. And if mortgage rates did come down, it would only temporarily improve affordability because we had an increase in demand with limited supply, and that would just drive prices right back up. So, yeah, I think that we really need to reform zoning and the permitting process and the tax structure in order to allow enough homes to be built so that we can have these market clearing prices, because I don't think we're going to get there unless we unrestrict supply.
Okay, that's a good point. That in the end, the elasticity of supply is going to matter a lot. All right. Well, we'll have to have you back at some point to discuss the land tax that you're a fan of,
Yeah.
and other things. But this was great, and thanks, Moses. And we'll we'll cut it here so that we don't end up going too long. And I'll just put one more plug here for the book. It's called "Hate the Game," and that's another thing I have questions about where that title comes from and what it means for Daryl's outlook on the world. But anyway, thanks very much, and goodbye, all.